Perpetual troll and former President Donald Trump seized on a lack of COVID recovery plan after his loss in November, and during December promoted arguably one of his best ideas, purely out of spite and with no intention of delivering, continuing the general trajectory of his political career. Since securing the wins where they outright promised $2,000 checks, our elected body, disproportionately composed of millionaires, has done everything in its power to chip away at this amount, saying, well, we already gave you $600. What did you do with that? While also doing everything in their power to bungle things despite wide popular support and insufficient resistance to hobble it effectively. That isn't stopping Democrats from bringing up means testing or showing open disdain for their constituents in a system where a disproportionate number of people are already at the poverty line or close to it. A perfect manifestation of this disconnect is the hilarious picture of Hillary Clinton horrified by the conditions working people live in. This attitude of open disdain for the poor continues when Kyrsten Sinema literally brought a cake to vote down a bill on a $15 minimum wage and what is in essence a livable wage for millions of Americans and approximately 839,000 of Sinema's constituents. Sinema, who initially supported these types of proposals, gave a thumbs down after placing her vote like she was dumping a gross date on Next. Things like this inevitably lead grifters who also didn't support the same minimum wage increase, like insurrection supporter Josh Hawley and nemesis of common decency Ted Cruz, to make statements claiming to be the party of the working class. I mean, I guess that works if you have no idea about their recent records, or that prior to this, Cruz's most recent attempt to pander to his base was to try and get the same haircut as Morgan Wallen after he got in trouble for saying the N-word. Instead of actually being effective, Democrats have ignored arguably their most popular policy implementation in years, direct cash payments in the form of the stimulus checks. These payments have increasingly brought the topic of universal basic income into conversation after Andrew Yang was the first presidential candidate to actually make it part of his platform, leaving some to think that perhaps it's time to try the long-considered and rarely implemented economic concept that's frequently come into conversation but rarely into practice, with some pilots providing promising results. Defined as a payment given to citizens without conditions to ensure an economic floor of sorts. As a concept, universal basic income has been around longer than most realize and existed in various capacities under different names, even being kicked around during America's infancy. In Agrarian Justice, a 1797 banger from founding father Thomas Jane, he proposed to pay every person, when arrived at the age of 21 years, the sum of £15 sterling to enable him or her to begin the world. Oh, the way that's written. It's so optimistic, humanistic, and way ahead of its time, especially for an era when a large segment of people weren't actually considered people. People often tend to vote in a way that they think will benefit them in a future when they've encountered some type of financial windfall, oblivious to the fact those very same decisions ensure that they will never see that outcome. It's because they've internalized some bullshit that rich people themselves don't even believe. Here's a quote that is often attributed to John Steinbeck. Socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And a telling sign, we see people say things like this now with billionaire replacing millionaire, as people simp exponentially harder. America is a country full of diehard capitalists who are surprisingly short on capital for people who feel that strongly. The idea that in America you can work and pick yourself up by your bootstraps ignores just how broken our current system is, for all but a privileged few, who themselves are able to rise to the top on a wave of subsidies, tax breaks, and a seemingly infinite number of ways to receive free money that they don't actually need and could never hope to actually spend. Elon Musk is a famously prolific welfare queen because getting money from the government is one of those things that's considered smart if you have tons of money and don't actually need to, but shameful and amoral if you're not wealthy, and people buy it hook, line, and sinker. As it stands now, capitalism currently holds you and your children, if you have any, hostage with death by starvation if you're not productive enough. The phrase incentive to work is often brought up as a reason why handouts are bad. People who say this are saying that without the threat of losing your house and ability to live your life, you wouldn't work for them. When John Cornyn isn't tweeting his favorite fancy steak dinners during the height of a global pandemic funded by oil lobbyists or taxpayers, he's making the argument against sufficient checks for people to live on because they might not want to go out and look for work during that same global pandemic. The fact that this idea persists now shows just how out of touch a lot of these dogshit leaders actually are. Research has been done on how people live when provided with an economic floor to ensure a standard of living, and it's decidedly not something that kills productivity the way they claim it will. However, they would rather inflict a tremendous amount of trauma on families and children as collateral damage to get you to work harder than they do. Between Cornyn and Sinema's responses, there's a bipartisan message of let them eat cake. or steak, depending on which state you caucus in. The way things currently are, productivity wildly outpaces economic growth, with an increasingly smaller portion of the pie going to the worker that helped produce that wealth that inevitably funded the campaign contribution for somebody like John Cornyn. Implementing an economic floor would be a way to help fight against this wage stagnation and correct some of that problem. Inflation is often brought up like it would be an immediate and catastrophic effect. Like it isn't currently a problem. You might remember the late night commercials with Matthew Lesko in his question mark suit from the late 90s.
Do you know that Nike shoes, Apple Computer, and even H. Ross Perot have used government money programs to help make their millions, and you can too? Well, my new book shows you 15,000 programs you could use to change your life. You can get a better job, get an education, or start your own business.
He's basically what it would be like if UBI was a person. So, if the government is willing to give free money to businesses, especially lately with those loosey-goosey PPP loans, why not individuals? An economic floor would allow people to cover their needs and also spend that money in a number of local smaller businesses that are affected by shutdowns. Even though something like UBI would theoretically benefit them, a lot of Americans still reject the idea outright because somebody could get something without working. Just like those hardworking, wealthy people do. This idea of getting something for nothing comes despite the fact that some of the most valuable companies in the world need you and your data in order to function and generate the billions of dollars they bring in every year. So, in a weird way, by bullshitting on the internet, or just existing today when there's so much data collected in our day-to-day activities, you're kind of, in a weird way, working. Just not how you're used to. Former Greek finance minister and economic professor Yanis Varoufakis proposes a universal basic dividend using this logic.
Capital is socially produced. Capital goods. Take, for instance, the capital stock of Google. To a large extent, it is produced by all of us. Every time we search something on the Google search engine, we are adding to the capital stock of Google. This is not just a consumer transaction. So if capital is socially produced, why are the returns to capital privatized? On what basis? To cut a long story short, my proposal has been for a number of years now what we call a universal basic dividend. So I believe that a percentage of all shares of all companies should go into a public equity trust, like a wealth fund for society, and the dividends should be distributed.
Additionally, you actually pay for a lot of things that make private companies money, and you don't see a return on your investment when they privatize those profits after socializing a lot of the costs. Siri, for instance, was developed by SRI International, formerly the Stanford Research Institute, an American nonprofit scientific research institute, and they used DARPA funding to produce it. This is anything but rare, too. The idea that's often pushed that innovation is only happening from the private market is total and utter bullshit. The private market just comes in after the fact, buys it, and then charges you out the ass for something that you actually helped to fund. In Alaska, citizens have paid in on oil infrastructure, so they see a return on that investment. Yet there's nothing similar for the innovation the taxpayers fund, even though it's helped the private market make absurd amounts of wealth. There's a large shift towards automated work or work that's done algorithmically. Like in the past, the number of jobs will be displaced. However, in this instance, the numbers are a little bit bigger than we've seen in the past. And our current lockdowns are kind of a dry run for what we could end up seeing. One reason why people are typically opposed to automation is because the productivity gains are almost always privatized and not in a way that benefits most people, even if we all help to pay for a lot of that tech. The reason why people are opposed to automation is because the productivity gains from innovation are almost always privatized, even if we all collectively help to pay for that technology. Economists like John Maynard Keynes predicted that increases in productivity would lead to people accomplishing more work in increasingly shorter amounts of time, but with the rise of automation, there is a very real possibility of an owner class that cuts the majority of people out of those benefits after they all help to pay for it. It doesn't have to be this way, though, as illustrated in the book Inventing the Future. It imagines the marriage of smart policymaking with regards to automation and universal basic income, and how this 1-2 combo could help reshape our thinking towards a number of pressing issues like climate change. If we have to reshape anything, though, we need to reshape our ideas of what it means to deserve something like universal basic income, and why we end up doing the things we end up doing with our time allotted. When people do actually support safety nets, there's still a weird paternalistic attitude where people think they should be able to choose the way people help themselves. Sometimes to the point where they support taking further money from those same impoverished welfare recipients to drug test them, just to be safe. I mean, if they don't have money, they must be spending all their money on drugs, right? Well, this actually ends up being a gift to the people running those companies from the people least suited to make that donation. Because you have to be high off your ass to think it was anything else. Take the case of Rick Scott in Florida, whose wife owned drug testing company Solantic, which allowed for that money to come right back into the family. Piss testing welfare recipients was just a way to extract money in order to enrich themselves while partaking in their favorite pastimes of pissing on you and telling you it's raining while also shitting on the pores. While we're worried about the cost of intervention, we should also consider what's currently being inflicted on anyone below the poverty line. Poverty Impedes Cognitive Function is the title of a paper published in the magazine Science. And the title pretty much speaks for itself. I don't know who listens you on here. It's a finding that's been found across numerous studies, and numerous studies have also found that cash transfers have helped people make several better decisions when it came to self-care. A recent post on NPR's Planet Money blog also likened the extra cognitive load to being like having pulled an overnighter. The specter of poverty haunts people like their own budgetary babada. Your threat of destitution also keeps people from advancing, as a bad job can eat up much of your mental bandwidth, meaning that even if it's theoretically easier to find a job while you have one, after working a full day, you might have the mental fortitude to improve your skills so that you can actually make that advancement. A skill like that might be something that could otherwise help you find a better occupation or develop your talents so that you could make it to a better position. But it's not enough to immediately pay the bills, even if it eventually could be. Not everyone would work in this way, though. But at the very least, it would allow people to have a little breathing room in order to develop skills that don't net their boss an immediate financial return. Since without the threat of destitution, employees could move to better positions with some financial consideration for the time between jobs, or even allow people to take on tasks that aren't as lucrative, making it not so much of a vow of poverty to take on any care-oriented work, while also providing a correction for inflation that leadership in the public and private sector has proven itself incapable of or just not interested in addressing. Theoretically, people are able to leave their jobs in order to find better work. But the threat of financial destitution and the fact that it's often easier to get a job without gaps in employment means that isn't actually true. The only way that works is if you already have a job lined up, and that can sometimes be like taking on a second full-time job in and of itself. When one also considers the number of toxic relationships that continue for financial reasons, or how many women stay in abusive relationships because they can't afford to support themselves, and possibly children without that relationship, implementation of universal basic income takes on a whole different dimension. By not implementing something that would go a long way in solving these situations, we're choosing to let them continue because people need to work to survive. Whether or not it actually makes sense because we're in a global pandemic, or because we're just fucking sociopaths. Lack of job opportunities can also often lead to somebody pursuing a life of crime. With that in mind, something like providing everyone with basic needs should be seen as crime intervention that can function as an investment in something other than a private prison company. In addition to making the pro-labor classic 9 to 5, Dolly Parton continued her trajectory of being a labor innovator and actually managed to run a pilot that demonstrates the impact of universal basic income in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, in response to a wildfire that destroyed a large segment of the area, with 2,400 structures destroyed, 1,000 of which were homes. Dolly Parton, a native of the same county, ended up leading the intervention to save Gatlinburg with her My People Fund, named for her song, which provided unconditional funding to citizens affected by the fires.
Dolly kind of intuitively and instinctively laid out the essence of the response, which is we need to put money in people's hands as quick as possible. Around here we use the term Dolly-ize, and that is really how do you take something and add the accessories to it, if you will, and really, more importantly, add the soul and the touch of Dolly, because when Dolly does something, it's big, it's exciting, it's personal, and it's effective.
In addition, a study was led by Professor Stacia West from the University of Tennessee Knoxville School of Social Work. This study was done on the population in order to measure the overall effect of universal basic income, and most excuses against UBI are proving to be unfounded. During the most recent big football game that I'm not going to name, Dolly Parton covered herself with an ad for Skillshare, where she sang a version of 9 to 5 called 5 to 9 that was geared towards pursuing a side gig you actually like or a creative hobby after work, which left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths because it seemed like it was suggesting a 12-hour workday. However, if a universal basic income, like the one Dolly actually put into practice in Gatlinburg, were put into place, people would be able to pursue a 5 to 9 like it was their 9 to 5 because they'd have their costs covered and have the mental bandwidth to fully develop their skills better than if they could only do them after working a full day. UBI isn't as fringe as people often paint it either, with a number of thinkers having supported at various points from across the spectrum, with a disproportionate number of intellectuals and people considered great minds on that list. Martin Luther King Jr. proposed something along the lines with his Poor People's Campaign, which centered around a proposed anti-poverty bill, which would have included a guaranteed basic income for Americans. This has largely been scrubbed from his legacy, though. Like anything that mentions talk of economic justice, in order to say some bullshit about colorblindness, while ignoring that certain groups statistically see a lot less green.
Many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk have all said they'd support something along these lines, but haven't actually done anything about it. Which is a lot like when I agree with my girlfriend on something that I think is a good idea, and that I'm going to do at some point, and sure, I should probably do the thing, but I don't, and I'm probably not going to unless she brings it up. And I'm more likely if she's got a cohesive plan or instructions for whatever it is I'm putting off this time. So maybe we should start making similar proposals for this kind of thing? As a policy, UBI isn't even exclusive to the left, with Richard Nixon even proposing it at one point, as documented in Utopia for Realists by economist Rutger Bregman. Milton Friedman also proposed a negative income tax in 2 different books, and Mitt Romney actually has a proposal right now giving a monthly cash benefit for as much as $350 per child. While some people might say that people don't deserve something if they don't pay in, it's important to remember that these are children, and while some pieces of shit might see them as a source of cheap labor, that's some straight-up Dickensian thinking, especially once you consider the additional cognitive load that's being put on developing children. I'm not going to lie though, UBI isn't without its downsides, even if they pale in comparison to those of the status quo. Outside of taxation and payment concerns over UBI, a major other concern is that it could serve as a Trojan horse to cut social programs. While it is definitely appealing to some, because UBI would almost certainly mean less money spent on welfare or elsewhere, we should use it as a means to address how expensive existence has become and work towards universal basic services like those in a lot of other industrialized nations. Especially in a time when we're dealing with a rapidly transmitting and mutating virus. At some point we have to ask if it's more important to provide herd immunity rapidly or preserve the massive profits of a small group of wealthy people who only see the rest of us as a way to get even more wealth. By implementing a universal basic income, we can honor Dr. King's legacy in a way that actually acknowledges the economic injustice that he sought to address. Because trust me, you guys need all the help you can get figuring out the proper way to honor someone's legacy. If you've made it this far, thank you very much. If you'd like to see more, like and subscribe, and I'll see you around. Thanks for watching.